It's the kind of story we tell ourselves about America. The idea that before there was this vast continent inhabited by dozens of different nations with hundreds of different tribes and languages. Then suddenly, one day across the water, a bunch of guys show up who had no idea they were going to be the founding fathers of the United States. And it's all because they were pilgrims seeking religious freedom. They landed on Plymouth Rock and signed the Mayflower Compact, creating the foundation of American democracy. And from there, it's just a straight shot to American exceptionalism. George Washington chopped down his father's cherry tree and told the truth. Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin, and the rest was just hard work. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence while sitting under a tree in the middle of a forest. Oh, and then everyone just got along afterwards and decided to start a country. This version of events has been around since the 19th century, but the reality is it's been whitewashed to remove everyone who didn't fit into the narrative. The tribes have been removed from the picture. Slavery has been sanitized. And instead of landing on Plymouth Rock, those pilgrims actually landed in Provincetown, 300 miles away from where Plymouth Rock is. So why do we still think this false narrative? Why has it been whitewashed? And what does any of this even mean for us today? Well, first let's talk about the word whitewash. That's right. We named this episode after a technique used to cover up corruption and wrongdoing. Whitewash is literally plaster made from animal bones, flour, and water that has been used since ancient Rome to cover up the bad stuff so you can't see it anymore. This technique has been used on buildings and statues, but more importantly, it has been used on history. In 2015, the New York Times ran an article titled "How the Crusades Were Remembered," and the author said, "Few historical events have been so thoroughly whitewashed as the Crusades." And the reason for that is because the Crusades were not a pretty thing. They were violent, bloody, chaotic, and they're generally regarded as a horrible period in history. So how did the Catholic Church make them seem better than they were? Well, they created a false narrative that stated the Crusades were a noble Christian endeavor to recapture the Holy Land from the hands of evil Muslims. In other words, they created a good guy versus bad guy story. And the more this story was repeated, the more people believed it, and the more politicians and historians alike whitewashed the Crusades until they became something that could be taught in Sunday schools and school curriculums. Okay, so if you're picking up what I'm putting down, you can probably guess that the story of America has gone through its own round of whitewashing. After all, these pilgrims didn't just show up in North America. They crossed the ocean from Europe and specifically from England. And when they got here, they didn't discover a virgin land devoid of people. In fact, what they found was a land already filled with hundreds of different nations and cultures. In fact, the land the Pilgrims landed on in 1620 was inhabited by the Wampanoag people. And a few years earlier, around 1614, the English had established a fort nearby and had begun trading with the natives. Of course, we don't really learn much about that in school. Instead, the only tribe we ever hear about is the Iroquois Confederacy, which at the time wasn't even close to where the Pilgrims landed. And their inclusion in American history is mostly due to the fact that they chose to fight alongside the Americans during the Revolutionary War. But beyond the tribes being left out of the picture, there is also the issue of the land itself. As Europeans colonized North America, the tribes were pushed further and further west, literally to the point of death. There are entire books dedicated to the Trail of Tears that go into great detail as to what happened to the Native Americans once the colonists started claiming the land for their own. But the Trail of Tears is only one example. There are countless stories of massacre, deceit, and broken treaties. And yet somehow we think the Pilgrims just showed up and everything was fine after that. We even have a saying for it: manifest destiny. It was simply the belief that God had ordained the United States to expand across the whole of North America. So manifest destiny is basically the idea that the colonizers had the right to take the land from the natives, kill the natives, enslave the natives, or if none of those options seemed like they would work, just make the natives disappear. Which brings us to the second group of people who have been whitewashed from American memory. You know, back in the early days of the U.S., the Pilgrims weren't the only ones crossing the Atlantic Ocean. In fact, long before the Mayflower arrived, African slaves had been crossing the ocean as well, except they weren't coming willingly, and the journey was not a nice one either. The conditions on slave ships were horrific. People were packed into the holds of ships like fish, and thousands upon thousands died en route to the New World. The first Africans arrived in 1619, when a British ship called the White Lion docked at a place called Point Comfort, now known as Fort Monroe in Virginia. And when I say arrived, I use the word loosely because technically they were kidnapped. They were taken against their will from their homes in West Africa and sold to the colonists who were waiting at the dock. So if you've heard the story of America before, you might know that the United States wasn't founded on slavery. That part's true. Slavery was legal in some of the colonies for decades before the United States was founded, but it wasn't until after. In 1787, the newly drafted Constitution legalized slavery throughout the United States. So they tried to ignore that slavery was happening, hoping that it would just go away. But obviously it didn't, and as the years went on, things got worse and worse. Then in 1861, there was a war over it. The South wanted to keep slavery around and the North didn't. And sadly, the story doesn't end there. Even after slavery was abolished, white America still needed a scapegoat for all their problems. And in the early 1900s, that scapegoat became the African Americans themselves. We won't get into it here, but if you want to learn more about this time in American history, I recommend the podcast Throughline. So, in summary, the America story goes something like this. A group of Englishmen left England and landed in what is now the United States and began exploring the land. They came across a few tribes of natives, but for the most part, it was empty. So they decided to stay. They invited their friends from England to come join them, and everyone got along. They built a country together, fought a war against England and won, and then they lived happily ever after. Except, and this is going to sound ridiculous, but except that never happened. In fact, the United States is far from perfect, but we keep telling this myth because there is power in a good story. When a story is simple and easy to remember, that means it can be mass-produced and taught to millions of kids. Stories can bring people together and inspire action, which is why it's important that we get the details right. When you think about it, this isn't any different than those fake news stories that are floating around right now. Just like the story of America has been whitewashed, so too has our modern understanding of the world. Unfortunately, though, unlike the story of America, most of us aren't taught to be skeptical of these modern fake news stories. So that raises the question, what should we do about it? Well, the first step towards fixing anything is admitting that there is a problem. And the second step is to educate yourself. If you want to know more about the real story of America, I highly suggest reading 1491 by Charles C. Mann. I'll put a link to it down below in the description. The book basically proves that the Americas weren't as empty as we've all been led to believe. In fact, as of 1500, there were more people living in the Americas than in Europe. Not to mention it was the Pueblo people who invented the concept of zero, not the Indians. Also, there were no cowboys and cattle hands in North America prior to 1620. The reality is, it was the Comanche people who were the first to introduce horses to the Great Plains, and they were doing it long before European settlers showed up. In fact, the book has a whole section dedicated to debunking the image of the savage Indians. According to Mr. Mann, the only reason European Americans were able to win the French and Indian War, the Revolutionary War, and the War of 1812 is because many of the Native Americans fought alongside the British. Had they not done so, the British would have lost every single war. So that's my little spiel about whitewashing. I'm sure there are plenty of inaccuracies in this episode, so please feel free to leave a comment down below with your thoughts. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.